There are sounds that change your life forever. The creak of a coffin being lowered, the slam of a courtroom gavel, the metallic click of handcuffs. But nothing prepared me for the sound that would haunt me most, the soft scrape of metal against wood as I opened my father's toolbox 3 months after his funeral. Inside, wrapped in an old shop rag stained with motor oil and 20 years of secrets, was evidence of a crime so devastating it would destroy everything I thought I knew about the man who raised me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert heat in Phoenix hits you like opening an oven door, but the cold that ran through my veins as I stared into that toolbox had nothing to do with Arizona weather. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until that moment in my father's garage, I believed the worst thing that could happen to me had already occurred. Bobby Mitchell, my dad, had died of a heart attack at 54, alone in his truck on a job site, leaving behind nothing but medical bills, a mortgage underwater, and a daughter who thought she knew him. Dad wasn't perfect, but he was mine. After my parents divorced when I was 12, he became my anchor in a world that suddenly felt unstable. Mom remarried Greg within a year, moved to the nice side of Scottsdale with my new half-brother Tyler, and somehow found ways to make me feel like a weekend visitor in what used to be my own life. But Dad never made me feel like anything other than his priority. Every other weekend became our sacred time. We'd work on projects in his garage, him teaching me the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver, showing me how to measure twice and cut once, passing down wisdom wrapped in the smell of sawdust and WD-40. Mitchell and Sons construction was his dream, even though the Sons part never materialized beyond me, and I was more interested in marketing campaigns than building campaigns. Still, he never stopped hoping I'd join the family business, never stopped leaving job site photos on my voicemail, never stopped believing that someday we'd work side by side building something lasting together. The irony wasn't lost on me that the only thing we'd end up building together was a wall of secrets I never knew existed. 3 months after the funeral, Mom finally decided it was time to clean out Dad's house. She'd been putting it off, claiming she couldn't handle the emotional weight, but I suspected she was more concerned about the financial weight. The house was going into foreclosure, and anything valuable needed to be identified and sold quickly. She handed me the keys with the kind of reluctant responsibility people reserve for unpleasant tasks they'd rather delegate. The house felt different without him in it, like a song playing in the wrong key. Everything was exactly where he'd left it, his coffee mug still in the sink, his reading glasses on the kitchen table next to a pile of unpaid bills. But it was the garage that drew me, the way crime scenes draw investigators. This was where he'd spent his real time, where his hands had shaped wood and metal into something useful, where he'd tried to teach me that fixing things was just another way of loving them. The red Craftsman toolbox sat on his workbench like a monument to his profession. It was vintage, probably from the 80s, with scratches and dents that told the story of decades spent on job sites. Dad was particular about his tools, treating them with the reverence other men reserved for sports cars or expensive watches. Each tool had its place, each drawer organized with military precision. He used to joke that you could tell everything about a man by looking at his toolbox, that sloppy tools meant sloppy work, and sloppy work was just another word for not caring. I'd inherited his attention to detail, but applied it to spreadsheets instead of blueprints. At 28, I was making decent money as a marketing coordinator for a tech startup downtown, living in a modern apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city Dad helped build. I thought I'd escaped the blue-collar world he'd wanted to share with me, thought I'd evolved beyond the limitations of his generation. Standing in that garage, surrounded by the tools of his trade, I felt the weight of my own arrogance settling around my shoulders like dust. The toolbox opened with the satisfying click of well-maintained latches. The top tray held the usual suspects: screwdrivers arranged by size, a tape measure worn smooth from years of use, a level that had helped him keep countless projects straight. But as I lifted the tray, my fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. Wrapped in an oil-stained shop rag and tucked beneath the bottom layer of tools was a manila envelope, thick with documents and photographs that would change everything I thought I knew about Robert Mitchell. The first photograph made my hands shake. It showed a young woman, maybe early 20s, with long dark hair and a smile that seemed forced. She was standing next to a car I recognized, Dad's old pickup truck from the early 2000s, the one he'd sold when I was in high school. But this wasn't a casual snapshot. Something about her posture, the way her eyes seemed to avoid the camera, the slight bruising on her wrist that was barely visible, unless you knew to look for it, suggested this wasn't a happy memory being preserved. The next photo showed the same woman, but now she looked different. Scared. Her hair was shorter, messier, and there were visible marks on her face that makeup couldn't quite hide. She was standing in front of what looked like a construction site, and in the background, just barely visible, was the Mitchell & Sons logo on a trailer. My father's business. My father's job site. My father's truck parked nearby. But it was the third photograph that made me drop the envelope, scattering its contents across the concrete floor of the garage. The woman was lying on what appeared to be a hospital bed, unconscious, with medical equipment surrounding her. Her face was swollen almost beyond recognition, and there were tubes and wires connecting her to machines I didn't want to understand. At the bottom of the photograph, in Dad's familiar handwriting, were the words Riverside General, March 15, 2003, and below that, in letters that seemed to burn themselves into my vision, I'm sorry. 22 years ago, I would have been 6 years old, too young to understand why Dad sometimes came home with scraped knuckles, too young to question why he occasionally received phone calls that made him pace the backyard for hours, too young to wonder why he sometimes stared out the window with an expression that looked like guilt wearing a mask of regret. But I wasn't 6 anymore, and the pieces of a puzzle I never knew existed were starting to form a picture I didn't want to see. The documents beneath the photographs told a story that contradicted every memory I had of the man who'd raised me. Police reports filed and then mysteriously withdrawn. Hospital records showing injuries consistent with prolonged physical abuse. A restraining order that had been filed but never served. And at the bottom of the pile, a handwritten letter addressed to Angel in my father's careful script. I know you'll never forgive me, the letter began, and you shouldn't. What I did was unforgivable, and what I didn't do was worse.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I was supposed to protect you, but instead I became the thing you needed protection from. The money I'm sending isn't enough, could never be enough, but it's all I can give you now. I know you moved away, changed your name, started over, and I hope you found the peace I stole from you. I think about you every day, about who you might have become if I hadn't broken the person you were trying to be. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I'm just asking you to know that not a day goes by that I don't wish I could take it back, could be the man you deserved instead of the monster I was. The letter was dated just 6 months before Dad's death, which meant whatever had happened between him and this woman named Angel had haunted him for over 2 decades. But who was she? How had their paths crossed? And why had he kept this secret locked away in his toolbox like some kind of shrine to guilt? More photographs revealed more pieces of the story. Construction sites where Dad had worked in the early 2000s. Timesheets showing Angel Martinez as a temporary employee, one of the few women working in the male-dominated world of commercial construction. Pay stubs showing she'd worked for Mitchell & Sons for almost 8 months before disappearing from the records entirely. And then tucked behind everything else, the document that made my blood run cold. It was a copy of a missing persons report, filed with the Phoenix Police Department on March 20, 2003, just 5 days after the date on the hospital photograph. Angel Martinez, age 22, had been reported missing by her sister, after failing to show up for work or return phone calls for 3 days. The report noted that she'd been the victim of domestic violence in the past, that she'd recently started a new job with a construction company, and that her car had been found abandoned in the parking lot of Riverside General Hospital. The case had been classified as voluntary disappearance, after investigators determined she'd withdrawn money from her bank account and purchased a bus ticket to Los Angeles. But looking at those hospital photos, seeing the extent of her injuries, reading the guilt in my father's letter, I knew Angel Martinez hadn't disappeared voluntarily. She'd run for her life, and the man who'd made running necessary was the same man who'd taught me to ride a bike, helped me with homework, and promised me that good men protect the people they love. The garage suddenly felt smaller, the Arizona heat more oppressive, the smell of motor oil more nauseating. I was sitting on the concrete floor, surrounded by evidence of a crime that had been buried for 22 years, holding photographs that proved the father I'd idealized was capable of violence I couldn't reconcile with my memories. Every bedtime story he'd told me, every birthday cake he'd helped me blow out, every moment of pride I'd felt when introducing him to friends, all of it was now contaminated by the knowledge of what those same hands had done to a woman who'd trusted him as her employer. But the most devastating discovery was still waiting at the bottom of the envelope. Copies of money transfers, dozens of them, showing payments sent to an account registered under the name Angela Morris in Los Angeles. The payments started in March 2003, just days after the missing person report, and continued monthly for 19 years, only stopping 3 months before Dad's death. The amounts varied, sometimes $500, sometimes $1,000, but they never stopped coming. Every month for nearly 2 decades, my father had sent money to the woman he'd brutalized, not out of generosity, but out of guilt, so consuming it had apparently driven him to bankruptcy. The medical bills I'd assumed came from his heart attack, the mortgage payments he'd struggled to make, the reason he'd never taken a vacation or bought himself anything nice. It all made sense now. He'd been paying for his crimes, literally and emotionally, for most of my adult life. The man I'd thought was struggling financially because construction work was unpredictable had actually been struggling because he was supporting 2 households, keeping his victim alive, while slowly killing himself with the weight of what he'd done. My phone was in my hand before I'd consciously decided to pick it up. The numbers 911 seemed to glow on the screen, but my fingers hesitated over the call button. Once I made this call, there would be no taking it back. Once I involved the police, Dad's secret would become public knowledge, his reputation would be destroyed, and I'd have to live with being the daughter who'd exposed her father's crimes. But looking at those photographs again, seeing the fear in Angel's eyes, remembering the bruises, and the hospital equipment, and the letter that confirmed my worst suspicions, I knew there was only one choice I could live with. Detective Maria Santos arrived 45 minutes after my call, accompanied by a crime scene photographer and a records specialist, who looked like she'd been pulled away from her weekend plans. Detective Santos was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the garage, before focusing on me with an intensity that made me suddenly aware of how I must look, sitting on a concrete floor, surrounded by evidence of a decades-old crime, clutching photographs, like they were toxic waste. "Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the kind of professional compassion that comes from years of delivering bad news to people who aren't prepared to receive it. "I understand you've discovered some disturbing materials related to your deceased father. Before we begin, I want you to know that nothing you show me today will reflect on you personally. You're not responsible for actions that occurred when you were a child, and you're doing the right thing by calling us." The next 3 hours passed in a blur of questions, photographs and forms that officially transformed my father from a deceased parent into a suspected criminal. Detective Santos examined each piece of evidence methodically, asking clarifying questions about dates and locations, taking notes in a handwriting so neat it could have been printed. The crime scene photographer documented everything, the camera flash creating stark shadows that made the garage feel more like a morgue than a workspace. "Based on what you've shown me today," Detective Santos finally said, closing her notebook and fixing me with those sharp eyes, "we'll be reopening the Angel Martinez missing person case and investigating it as a potential assault and kidnapping. The evidence you've discovered suggests your father may have been involved in serious crimes, and the money transfers indicate he was aware of his culpability. This is going to become a very public investigation, and I need you to be prepared for that." The word kidnapping hit me like cold water. I'd been thinking assault, domestic violence, maybe aggravated battery, but kidnapping suggested something more sinister, more planned, more calculated than a moment of rage that got out of hand. Detective Santos must have seen the shock on my face because she leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "The hospital records you found show Angel Martinez was admitted as a Jane Doe," she explained, "which means someone brought her there unconscious and left without identifying themselves or her. The injuries documented in her file are consistent with prolonged captivity and systematic abuse. The fact that she disappeared immediately after being discharged, combined with the money transfers your father made, suggests he may have held her against her will and then paid for her silence and relocation." The words hung in the garage air, like dust motes, visible but impossible to sweep away. My father, the man who'd taught me that a person's word was their bond, who'd insisted that real strength meant protecting people smaller than yourself, who'd made me feel safe in a world that often felt dangerous, had apparently spent months terrorizing a young woman who trusted him as her boss. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, like trying to reconcile two photographs that had been torn in half and taped back together incorrectly. "What happens now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Now we try to find Angel Martinez," Detective Santos said, gathering the evidence into clear plastic bags that would preserve it for whatever legal proceedings might follow. "We verify her current identity, make contact if possible, and see if she's willing to provide a statement about what happened in 2003. We'll also be examining your father's financial records, interviewing people who worked with him during that time period, and basically reconstructing a case that's been cold for over 2 decades. As the detective and her team prepared to leave, taking with them the contents of Dad's toolbox and most of my illusions about the man who'd raised me, I found myself alone in the garage that no longer felt like a sanctuary. The empty toolbox sat open on the workbench, its drawers extended like a mouth caught mid-scream, revealing nothing but shadows and the outlines of tools that would never again be used to build anything. The drive back to my apartment in downtown Phoenix felt longer than usual, the familiar streets seeming foreign in the way that everything looks different when you're seeing it through new eyes. I kept thinking about Angel Martinez, wondering where she was now, whether she'd built a life for herself in Los Angeles, whether she still looked over her shoulder when walking alone, whether the monthly payments from my father had helped or hurt her ability to move on from whatever he'd done to her. But I also kept thinking about Dad, about the man I'd thought I knew, versus the man the evidence suggested he'd been. How do you reconcile 28 years of love and guidance, with proof that the person you trusted most was capable of unthinkable cruelty? How do you maintain the good memories, while acknowledging that they were built on a foundation of secrets so dark they'd literally killed the person keeping them? The investigation that followed would reveal details I wished I'd never learned, would force me to confront truths about my family that rewrote my entire understanding of my own history, and would ultimately lead to a reunion I never expected with a woman who'd spent over 2 decades running from the shadow of my father's crimes. But that night, sitting in my apartment surrounded by the normal sounds of city life, all I could think about was the sound of that toolbox opening, the soft scrape of metal against wood that had changed everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the people we choose to believe in. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more revelations, more evidence that the man who'd raised me had also destroyed someone else's daughter. But tonight I just sat with the knowledge that some secrets are too heavy for one person to carry, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to make sure their victims finally get the justice they deserve, even if it means destroying the memory of the person you thought you loved. Sleep didn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Angel Martinez's face from those photographs, the progression from hope to terror to unconsciousness, playing like a slideshow behind my eyelids. By dawn I'd consumed half a pot of coffee and made a decision that would have seemed impossible 12 hours earlier. I was going to find out everything about what my father had done, not just the sanitized version the police investigation would uncover, but the complete truth that lived in the spaces between official reports and legal documents. The Phoenix Public Library opened at 9, and I was waiting by the doors when the librarian turned the key. The microfilm archives held copies of local newspapers dating back decades, and I needed to see what, if anything, had been reported about Angel Martinez's disappearance in 2003. The machine hummed to life as I scrolled through March editions of the Arizona Republic, searching for any mention of a missing construction worker or a Jane Doe found at Riverside General. What I found was worse than some. There was coverage, but it painted a picture so different from the evidence in Dad's toolbox that it felt like reading about a completely different case. "Local woman leaves town after workplace accident," read the headline from March 25, 2003. The article was brief, clinical, and devastating in its implication. According to the report, Angel Martinez had been injured in a fall at a construction site, treated at Riverside General, and subsequently decided to relocate to California to live with relatives while recovering from her injuries. The article quoted Detective Frank DiMaggio, Dad's business partner, describing Angel as a troubled young woman who'd had some personal difficulties, and expressing hope that the change of scenery would give her a fresh start. There was no mention of missing person reports, no suggestion of foul play, no indication that anything more sinister than a workplace accident had occurred. Someone had managed to control the narrative completely, turning what the evidence suggested was kidnapping and assault into a story about a woman making a voluntary decision to start over somewhere else. But the most chilling detail was buried in the final paragraph. The article mentioned that Mitchell and Sons Construction had generously established a fund to help with Angel's medical expenses and relocation costs, describing it as an example of how local businesses take care of their employees during difficult times. Those monthly payments Dad had been making weren't guilt money or hush money. They were being portrayed as corporate charity, a benevolent gesture that painted him as a caring employer, rather than the criminal the evidence suggested he was. The realization hit me like physical weight settling on my chest. This hadn't been a crime of passion that spiraled out of control. This had been a calculated campaign to destroy Angel Martinez's credibility, erase her story, and replace it with a version that protected my father's reputation and business interests. Someone with influence had made phone calls, pulled strings, and ensured that a young woman's disappearance would be remembered as her choice rather than her escape. I printed every article I could find about Mitchell and Sons from that time period, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might explain how a small construction company had managed to manipulate a police investigation and control media coverage. What I discovered was a business that was far more connected than I'd realized. Dad hadn't just been a contractor, he'd been part of a network of builders, developers, and city officials who'd shaped Phoenix's growth during the early 2000s boom years. The Mitchell and Sons client list read like a who's who of local power brokers, shopping centers for the Diamondback Development Group, whose CEO had served on the city council, office buildings for Sunrise Properties, owned by a family that had donated heavily to police benevolent associations, residential developments for Desert Vista Homes, whose founder's brother was a judge in Maricopa County. These weren't just business relationships, they were the kind of connections that could make problems disappear and ensure that inconvenient truths never saw daylight. By afternoon, I'd compiled a timeline that painted a picture of systematic corruption disguised as community leadership. The same month Angel Martinez disappeared, Mitchell and Sons had been awarded 3 major city contracts worth over $2 million. The detective who'd initially handled Angel's missing person case had retired early with a full pension just 6 months later. The reporter who'd written the sanitized newspaper account had left journalism shortly after and taken a job in corporate communications for one of Dad's biggest clients. But the most disturbing connection was the one I'd missed initially. Frank DiMaggio, Dad's business partner, who'd been quoted in the newspaper defending the official story, was married to Linda Hartley, who became Linda Mitchell after my parents divorced, and then became Linda Hartley again when she married Greg. My mother had been married to Dad's business partner before she'd been married to Dad, which meant the 2 men who'd controlled my childhood had also been business partners during the time Angel Martinez disappeared. The implications were staggering. Mom hadn't just left Dad for another man, she'd left him for the man who'd helped cover up his crimes. The divorce that had shaped my adolescence, the custody arrangement that had made me feel torn between 2 households, the financial struggles that had defined Dad's later years. All of it was connected to secrets that went far deeper than I'd imagined. My entire family structure had been built around protecting a lie that had destroyed a young woman's life and nearly destroyed my father's soul in the process. That evening, I called Detective Santos with the information I'd gathered, expecting her to be surprised by the scope of what I'd uncovered. Instead, her reaction suggested she'd been conducting her own investigation and reaching similar conclusions. "We've been looking into the original handling of the Martinez case," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent the day discovering uncomfortable truths about her own department. "There are irregularities in the file that suggest someone with influence was involved in shaping how the investigation proceeded. We're going to need to interview everyone who was connected to your father's business during that time period, including family members who might have been aware of what was happening." The word family hung in the air like a threat. Mom and Greg lived in a gated community in North Scottsdale, in a house that had been purchased with profits from the business empire they'd built after leaving Dad behind with his guilt and his monthly payments to Angel Martinez. They'd created a perfect life for themselves, complete with Tyler, the son Greg had always wanted, and a social circle that included many of the same people who'd helped bury Angel's story 22 years earlier. "When will you want to speak with them?" I asked, though I was really asking how much time I had before my family's carefully constructed world came crashing down around them. "Soon," Detective Santos replied, "but first, we need to try to locate Angel Martinez. The financial records your father kept show the payments were being sent to an Angela Morris in Los Angeles, but we need to verify that's the same person and see if she's willing to provide a statement about what happened. That conversation needs to happen before we start interviewing potential witnesses or co-conspirators." The word co-conspirators echoed in my mind long after I'd hung up the phone. 24 hours ago, my biggest problem had been figuring out what to do with Dad's tools and whether to keep his truck.
Now I was facing the possibility that my entire family had been involved in covering up crimes that had haunted my father for decades and destroyed a young woman's faith in justice. But there was something else, a detail that had been nagging at me since I'd first seen those photographs. Angel Martinez had been 22 when she disappeared, just 6 years older than I was at the time. Looking at her face in those early pictures, I could see something familiar in her features, something that reminded me of someone I couldn't quite place. The dark hair, the shape of her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, when she wasn't smiling, it all seemed connected to a memory I couldn't access directly. Part 3, the present moment setup. The call from Detective Santos came at 7 in the morning, 3 days after I'd handed over the contents of Dad's toolbox. I was already awake, staring at my laptop screen where I'd been researching private investigators in Los Angeles, trying to figure out how to find Angela Morris on my own.
The police investigation stalled. The detective's voice was tense, professional, but underneath the official tone I could hear something that sounded like excitement mixed with dread. "We found her," she said without preamble. "Angela Morris is Angel Martinez, and she's agreed to speak with us. But there's something you need to know before we proceed. She asked specifically to meet with you first, alone, before she'll provide an official statement to the police." The request hit me like cold water. Why would a woman who'd been brutalized by my father want to meet with me? What could I possibly offer her except apologies for crimes I hadn't committed and explanations for behavior I couldn't understand? But even as these questions raced through my mind, I knew I had to say yes. Angel Martinez had spent 22 years carrying secrets that had shaped my entire life without me knowing it. If she was finally ready to tell her story, the least I could do was listen. "She's flying in tomorrow," Detective Santos continued. "She wants to meet at Steele Indian School Park at 2 o'clock near the Memorial Garden. She said she'll recognize you from your social media photos, and she'll be wearing a red baseball cap. Miss Mitchell, I have to advise you that this meeting could be emotionally difficult for both of you. She's been through trauma that's directly connected to your father, and learning the details of what happened may change how you remember him permanently." As if my memories of Dad hadn't already been shattered beyond repair. But I understood what the detective was really saying. Up until now, I'd been dealing with evidence, documents, photographs that suggested terrible things had happened. Tomorrow, I'd be facing the living person those terrible things had happened to, and there would be no more room for doubt or denial, or the small hope I'd been harboring that maybe the evidence was somehow misleading. The park was busier than I'd expected for a Tuesday afternoon, filled with joggers and dog walkers and mothers pushing strollers along the winding paths. I'd arrived early, partly from nervousness and partly because I needed time to prepare myself for a conversation I had no idea how to navigate. The Memorial Garden was quieter, a circular space surrounded by desert plants and marked with stones bearing the names of people who died too young. It felt appropriate somehow, meeting in a place dedicated to remembering the dead, considering that Angel Martinez had been declared dead by my father's actions even though she'd survived them. She appeared at exactly 2 o'clock, walking slowly along the path that led to the garden, her red baseball cap pulled low over her face. Even from a distance, I could see the resemblance to the young woman in those photographs, but 22 years had changed her in ways that went beyond simple aging. She moved with the careful awareness of someone who'd learned to scan for threats, to position herself near exits, to never fully relax even in public spaces. Her voice was softer than I'd expected, with a slight accent that suggested she'd spent time in places where Spanish was spoken as often as English. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "Thank you for asking to meet," I replied, though the words felt inadequate for the moment. "I'm sorry about what my father did to you. I know that doesn't change anything, but I needed you to hear it." Angel smiled, but it was the kind of smile that held more sadness than joy. "Your father said a lot of things too, especially toward the end. The letters he sent with the money, they were full of apologies and regret. But words don't erase scars, and money doesn't give you back the person you were before someone broke you." We sat on a bench facing the memorial stones, two women connected by violence neither of us had chosen but both of us had been shaped by. Angel was smaller than I'd expected, probably 5 feet 4 inches and slender in the way that suggested someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. Her hands were steady as she pulled a manila folder from her purse, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing around to make sure we were alone. "The police told you what they found in your father's toolbox," she said, "but they didn't tell you everything, because they don't know everything yet. There are parts of this story that only I can tell you, things that your father never wrote down because they were too terrible to put on paper. The folder contained copies of documents I hadn't seen before. Medical records from multiple hospitals, not just Riverside General. Photographs that showed injuries in various stages of healing, chronicling weeks of systematic abuse. And at the bottom, a single sheet of paper that made my hands shake as I read it. It was a birth certificate for a child born at Riverside General on March 14, 2003, one day before the date on the hospital photograph I'd found in Dad's toolbox. The mother was listed as Angel Martinez. The father was listed as unknown. The child's name was Robert Angel Martinez, and according to the certificate, he'd been placed for adoption immediately after birth. Your father didn't just assault me, Angel said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. He held me for almost 4 months, from November 2002 until March 2003. I was pregnant when it started, about 6 weeks, from a relationship with someone I'd been dating before I started working for Mitchell & Sons. But your father convinced himself the baby was his, that I was carrying his child, and that gave him the right to control every aspect of my life. The memorial garden suddenly felt smaller, the desert heat more oppressive, the sound of distant traffic more intrusive. I was sitting next to a woman who'd been imprisoned by my father, who'd given birth while being held captive, who'd been forced to give up her child, because she couldn't provide for him while running for her life. The man who'd taught me to ride a bicycle, had stolen someone else's pregnancy, had turned what should have been joy into terror, had made motherhood into a nightmare this woman had been living with for over 2 decades. The money he sent, I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears, was it for you or for the baby? Both, Angel replied. The adoption was arranged through a lawyer who was connected to your father's business associates. The family who took Robert knew some version of the truth, enough to understand that his mother was in danger and couldn't maintain contact. The monthly payments were split between an account for me and a trust fund for him. Your father may have been a monster, but he was a monster who understood he'd created responsibilities he needed to fulfill. The weight of this revelation settled over me like a physical presence. Somewhere in the world, probably in Los Angeles based on the financial records, there was a 22-year-old man, who was my half-brother, whose existence had been hidden from me for my entire life, whose mother was sitting next to me in a memorial garden, explaining how my father had destroyed her life, before he'd even been born. Does he know, I asked, about any of this? His adoptive parents told him he was adopted, and they've always been honest about the fact that his birth mother was in a dangerous situation when he was born. But they don't know the details, and until last week, they didn't know his biological father was dead. The lawyer who arranged the adoption contacted them when the police started asking questions about the financial transfers. That's how I found out about your father's death, and that's how I found out someone had discovered his secret. Angel reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph, recent and obviously digital, showing a young man who looked so much like my father at that age that it took my breath away. Same dark hair, same stubborn jawline, same eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. He was wearing graduation robes and smiling at the camera with the kind of confidence that comes from being raised by people who love you unconditionally. His name is Bobby Morris now, Angel said, watching my face as I stared at the photograph. He just graduated from UCLA with a degree in engineering, and he's never known a day of violence or fear in his life. His parents, David and Maria Morris, they're good people who've given him everything I couldn't. But he's always known that someday he might want to meet his birth family, and someday has apparently arrived. The implications crashed over me like waves. This young man, my half-brother, was going to learn that his biological father was a criminal who'd held his mother captive. He was going to discover that his existence was the result of months of systematic abuse. He was going to find out that the family he might have imagined meeting was actually a collection of people who'd spent decades covering up the crimes that had shaped his entire life story. What does he want? I asked, though I wasn't sure I was ready to hear the answer. He wants to meet you, Angel said simply. He wants to understand his history. Even if it's painful, he wants to know if he has siblings, what his father was like, whether there are family traits he should be aware of. He doesn't know the details yet, but he knows something serious happened, and he's mature enough to handle the truth. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the desert plants surrounding the memorial garden, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to shift every time I blinked. I was sitting in a place dedicated to remembering the dead, talking to a woman my father had tried to erase, learning about a brother whose existence had been hidden from me for my entire life. The conversation felt surreal, like something happening to someone else that I was observing from a distance. There's something else, Angel continued, and I realized that despite everything she'd already told me, we were still just scratching the surface of secrets that had been buried for over 2 decades. Your father wasn't working alone. The lawyer who arranged the adoption, the people who helped control the narrative around my disappearance, the business associates who made sure the police investigation went away, they're all still out there. They all know what really happened, and they all have reasons to want this story to stay buried. The bench beneath me suddenly felt less stable, as if the ground itself was shifting. I'd been thinking of Dad's crimes as personal failures, terrible choices made by one man who'd spent decades paying for them. But Angel was describing something much larger, a network of people who'd collaborated to cover up kidnapping and assault, who'd manipulated police investigations and controlled media coverage, who'd turned a young woman's trauma into a business problem that needed to be managed. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Why are you willing to trust me with information that could be dangerous if the wrong people find out you're talking? Angel was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on the memorial stones, as if she was reading the names of people who'd died too young, and thinking about all the ways a life could be destroyed without actually ending it. Because 22 years ago, I was alone, she finally said. I had no family support, no resources, no connections to people with power or influence. The system that was supposed to protect me instead protected the man who hurt me, and I learned that justice isn't something that happens automatically. You have to fight for it, and sometimes you have to wait decades for the right moment to arrive. She turned to look at me directly, and I could see something in her eyes that I recognized from my own mirror, the expression of someone who'd made a decision that would change everything. You found that evidence, she continued. You called the police when you could have thrown it away, and pretended you'd never seen it. You're here talking to me when you could have let the lawyers handle everything. That tells me you're someone who chooses truth over comfort, and truth is the only thing that's going to give my son the family history he deserves to know. Part 4. The triggering incident. The call came at midnight, jolting me from the kind of restless sleep that follows conversations that reorganize your entire understanding of reality. The number was local but unfamiliar, and something about receiving a phone call at that hour made my heart rate spike before I even answered. Sarah Mitchell. The voice was male, older with the kind of authority that comes from decades of being accustomed to having people listen when you speak. This is David Brennan. I represented your father in various legal matters over the years, and I understand you've been speaking with the police about some materials you found among his belongings. I was fully awake now, sitting up in bed with the phone pressed to my ear, and every instinct screaming that this conversation was not going to go well. David Brennan was the lawyer who'd arranged Bobby's adoption, the man who'd helped cover up Angel's kidnapping, one of the people Angel had warned me about who had reasons to want this story buried. Brennan, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fact that my hands were shaking. It's rather late for a business call. Yes, well, some matters can't wait for normal business hours, he replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. I'm calling because there seems to be some confusion about the nature of certain financial transactions your father made over the years, and I'd hate for that confusion to lead to unnecessary complications for your family. The word complications hung in the air like a threat. This wasn't a lawyer calling to offer assistance. This was someone calling to assess how much I knew, and how much trouble I might cause for people who'd spent decades keeping secrets. I'm not sure what you mean, I said, though we both knew I understood exactly what he meant. The payments your father made to Angel Martinez were part of a legal settlement agreement, Brennan continued, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to making lies sound official. Martinez was injured in a workplace accident, and your father's company provided compensation for her medical expenses and lost wages. The arrangement was handled privately to avoid the publicity and legal costs associated with formal litigation. Even in my shocked state, I could recognize the careful language of someone trying to create an alternative narrative to explain away evidence of criminal behavior. Brennan was offering me a version of events that would make the monthly payments seem legitimate, that would transform Dad from a criminal into a responsible employer who'd done the right thing after an unfortunate accident. Mr. Brennan, I said, my voice gaining strength as my anger began to override my fear. I've seen the photographs.
I've read the medical records. I've spoken with Angel Martinez herself. Whatever story you're trying to sell, I'm not buying it. The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to wonder if he'd hung up, but when he spoke again, his tone had shifted from authoritative to openly threatening. Miss Mitchell, I think you may be underestimating the complexity of the situation you're involving yourself in. The people who helped arrange Miss Martinez's relocation and ongoing support include individuals with significant influence in this community. Disrupting arrangements that have worked successfully for over 2 decades could have consequences that extend far beyond your father's reputation. There it was, the threat I'd been expecting since Angel had warned me about the network of people who'd helped cover up Dad's crimes. Brennan wasn't just calling to offer legal advice. He was calling to let me know that powerful people were watching my actions, and that continuing to cooperate with the police investigation could result in retaliation against me or my family. Are you threatening me, Mr. Brennan? I asked, though the question was more for clarification than because I had any doubt about what was happening. I'm providing you with information that might help you make informed decisions about how to proceed, he replied. The lawyer speak, barely disguising the menace underneath. Your family has built a good life in this community. Your mother and stepfather have established businesses and relationships that could be affected if certain old stories were to be reopened and mischaracterized by people who don't understand the full context. The mention of Mom and Greg hit me like a physical blow. Not only were they going to be implicated in the police investigation as people who'd known about Dad's crimes, but now they were potentially being threatened by the same network that had helped cover up those crimes originally. The people who'd protected Dad 22 years ago were still in positions of power, still willing to use that power to protect themselves, and still capable of destroying anyone who threatened to expose their involvement. What exactly are you asking me to do? I said, though I already knew the answer. I'm suggesting that you might want to reconsider the wisdom of pursuing this matter further, Brennan replied. The materials you found were private correspondence related to a legal settlement. Turning them over to the police was understandable given your emotional state following your father's death, but continuing to cooperate with an investigation based on misunderstandings could cause unnecessary harm to everyone involved, including Miss Martinez herself. The suggestion that cooperating with the police might harm Angel was particularly disgusting, considering that this man had helped orchestrate the cover-up that had forced her to live in hiding for over 2 decades. But I could hear the calculation in his voice, the assumption that I would prioritize my family's comfort over a stranger's justice, that I would choose the easier path of letting sleeping dogs lie rather than risking conflict with powerful people. Mr. Brennan, I said, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded, I think this conversation is over. If you want to discuss this matter further, you can contact me through my attorney. You may want to think carefully about whether involving more lawyers is really in your best interest, he replied. But I'd already ended the call, and was staring at my phone's screen, watching his number disappear, as if the conversation had never happened. But of course it had happened, and it represented a line being crossed that changed everything about how I understood the situation I'd stumbled into. Up until that moment, I'd been thinking about Dad's crimes as historical events that needed to be investigated and addressed through proper legal channels. Now I was being actively threatened by people who'd spent decades covering up those crimes, and who were apparently willing to escalate their efforts to keep them buried. The next morning brought confirmation that Brennan's call hadn't been an isolated incident. I woke up to find 3 missed calls from unknown numbers, 2 voicemails that were just dial tones followed by hang-ups, and a text message from a number with no identifying information that simply read, "Think carefully about the choices you're making." At work, my assistant mentioned that someone had called asking detailed questions about my schedule and whether I typically left the office for lunch. When I arrived home that evening, I noticed that the lock on my apartment door looked different, as if someone had been practicing picking it, and there were subtle signs that someone had been inside while I was gone. Nothing was missing, nothing was obviously disturbed, but the violation was clear. I called Detective Santos immediately, but her response was what I'd expected and dreaded. "We can file a report about the threatening phone call and the possible break-in," she said. "But unless we have specific evidence of who's responsible, there's not much we can do beyond increasing patrols in your area. The people you're dealing with are sophisticated enough to know how to intimidate without crossing lines that would give us grounds for immediate action." That evening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. I called Angel Martinez and asked if I could meet with Bobby Morris, my half-brother whose existence I'd learned about less than 24 hours earlier. If the people who'd covered up Dad's crimes were escalating their efforts to silence me, I needed to understand the full scope of what they were protecting against. Are you sure you're ready for that? Angel asked, her voice carrying the concern of someone who understood exactly how overwhelming the truth could be. Meeting Bobby means learning details about what happened that I haven't told you yet. It means accepting that your father's crimes were more extensive than you've realized, and it means acknowledging that the family you thought you knew was built on lies that destroyed multiple lives. I'm sure, I said, though I wasn't sure of anything except that I couldn't continue living with partial knowledge while people with the power to destroy my life were actively threatening me for seeking the truth. He's driving up from Los Angeles tomorrow, Angel said. He wants to meet at the same place we met, in the Memorial Garden. But Sarah, once you have this conversation, there's no going back to not knowing. Are you prepared for that? The question echoed in my mind long after I'd hung up the phone. Was I prepared to learn details that would make the evidence I'd already seen seem manageable by comparison? Was I ready to meet a brother whose existence proved that Dad's crimes had created another victim, another person whose life had been shaped by violence they'd never chosen? Was I strong enough to handle whatever additional secrets were waiting to be revealed? The answer was probably no, but the alternative was living with the knowledge that I'd chosen ignorance over truth, comfort over justice, and my own peace of mind over the right of victims to finally be heard. 24 hours earlier, I'd been a woman dealing with the aftermath of her father's death, and the discovery of his secret crimes. Now I was someone being actively threatened by powerful people who had every reason to want me silenced, and who were apparently willing to escalate their tactics to protect secrets they'd been keeping for over 2 decades. But I was also someone who'd inherited more than just my father's tools. I'd inherited his stubbornness, his refusal to back down when he believed he was right, and his understanding that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. The difference was that I was going to use those traits to fight for justice rather than to cover up crimes, to protect victims rather than to silence them, and to ensure that the truth finally had a chance to be heard by people who had the power to act on it. The Memorial Garden tomorrow would witness another conversation that would change everything I thought I knew about my family, my history, and myself. But this time, I wouldn't be walking into it blind. This time, I'd be walking into it with the knowledge that powerful people were watching, that my choices had consequences that extended far beyond my own life, and that sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that feel impossible to make. Part 5. The Origin Foundation. Bobby Morris looked exactly like the photographs Angel had shown me, but seeing him in person was like encountering a ghost made flesh. He had Dad's bone structure, the same way of holding his shoulders when he was thinking, the same unconscious habit of running his hand through his hair when he was nervous. But there was something in his expression that Dad had never possessed, a kind of openness that comes from being raised by people who answer questions honestly and don't require you to navigate hidden currents of anger and resentment. He was waiting by the memorial stones when I arrived, dressed in jeans and a UCLA Engineering Department t-shirt, looking every inch the successful college graduate his adoptive parents had raised him to be. When he saw me approaching, he stood up with the kind of tentative smile that suggested he was as nervous about this meeting as I was. "Sarah," he said, extending his hand in a gesture that was formal but warm. "I'm Bobby. This is kind of surreal, isn't it?" The handshake lasted a moment longer than necessary, both of us studying each other's faces for family resemblances, and trying to process the fact that we were siblings who'd lived 28 and 22 years respectively, without knowing the other existed. His grip was firm, calloused in the way that suggested he'd inherited Dad's affinity for working with his hands despite being raised in a completely different environment. "Thank you for coming," I said, though the words felt inadequate for the magnitude of what we were both walking into. "Angel told me you wanted to understand your history, even if it turned out to be difficult." "She told me some of it," Bobby replied, his voice carrying the careful control of someone who'd been preparing himself for bad news. "She said our father held her against her will for several months, that I was born while she was being held captive, and that she had to give me up for adoption because she was running for her life when I was born. But she also said there were details she thought I should hear from you, things about what kind of man he was and what kind of family I'm connected to." We sat on the same bench where Angel and I had talked the day before, two young adults connected by violence that had shaped both our lives in completely different ways. Bobby had been raised by people who'd loved him unconditionally, who'd given him every opportunity to succeed, who'd created a stable foundation that had allowed him to become everything Dad had probably hoped I would become. Meanwhile, I'd been raised by the man who'd committed the crimes that necessitated Bobby's adoption, shaped by secrets I hadn't known existed, carrying guilt for actions I hadn't committed, but that had defined my father's entire adult life. "What do you remember about him?" Bobby asked, and I realized that despite everything I'd learned about Dad's crimes, I was still the only person who could tell this young man what it had been like to be Robert Mitchell's child during the years when he was trying to live with what he'd done. "He was complicated," I said, trying to find words that were honest without being cruel. "He loved me, I know that much. He taught me practical things, how to fix things that were broken, how to solve problems by thinking them through systematically. He was patient when he was teaching, and he never made me feel stupid for asking questions or making mistakes." Bobby nodded, taking notes in a small notebook he'd pulled from his pocket. The adoptive family information said he was in construction. Was he successful? Was he respected in the community? The questions were innocent enough, but they highlighted the complexity of trying to explain a man who'd been simultaneously a devoted father and a violent criminal. How do you tell someone that their biological father was skilled at his profession, but used those same skills to construct a prison for their mother? How do you explain that he was respected by clients and employees who never knew about the crimes he was committing in private? "He was very good at his work," I said carefully. "People trusted him to build things that would last, and he took pride in delivering
Projects on time and under budget. But there was always something underneath, a kind of tension that I didn't understand at the time. He worked too much, worried too much about money, and sometimes I'd catch him staring out the window with an expression that looked like he was carrying weight that was too heavy for one person to handle." "Guilt," Bobby said simply. "He was carrying guilt about what he'd done to my mother." The directness of the statement was startling. This young man had been told that his existence was the result of months of systematic abuse, and he was processing that information with a maturity that suggested his adoptive parents had prepared him well for difficult truths. But there was something else in his voice, a note of sadness that suggested he was grieving for the father he might have had if circumstances had been different. "Angel said he sent money every month," Bobby continued. "For both of us, to help with my upbringing and to support her while she was in hiding. That suggests he understood he'd created responsibilities he needed to fulfill, even if he couldn't undo the harm he'd caused." I pulled out copies of the financial records Detective Santos had given me, showing Bobby the pattern of payments that had continued for almost 20 years. The amounts varied depending on what he could afford, but they never stopped coming. Even when his business was struggling, even when he was behind on his own bills, he made sure the transfers went through. Bobby studied the records with the analytical mind of an engineering student, looking for patterns and drawing conclusions based on the data in front of him. "The payments increased every year," he noted. "Not just for inflation, but significantly, and they spiked around what would have been my birthdays and graduations. He was tracking my milestones even though he couldn't be part of them." The realization hit both of us simultaneously. Dad hadn't just been sending guilt money, he'd been trying to be a father from a distance, marking the occasions that mattered in Bobby's life even though he could never acknowledge their relationship publicly. Every birthday, every Christmas, every graduation, Dad had increased the payments as if he was giving gifts to a son he could never claim. "There's something else," I said, pulling out a folder I'd brought with me. After I found the evidence in his toolbox, I went through everything in his house more carefully. I found these hidden in a box behind the water heater. The photographs I showed Bobby were different from the ones that documented Angel's injuries. These were pictures of him, obviously taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, chronicling his growth from toddler to teenager. Bobby at a playground with his adoptive parents. Bobby in a school play wearing what appeared to be a robot costume made from cardboard boxes. Bobby at what looked like a high school graduation ceremony, wearing a cap and gown and hugging the man and woman who'd raised him. "He was stalking me," Bobby said, but his voice held wonder rather than horror. "Not in a threatening way, but he was keeping track of my life. He knew what I looked like, what kind of kid I was becoming, what kind of family I was part of." The photographs spanned nearly 2 decades, suggesting that Dad had made regular trips to Los Angeles to observe Bobby from afar. Some were clearly taken at public events, school functions where any parent might be present with a camera. Others appeared to be shot from vehicles parked across the street from houses or schools, suggesting a more deliberate surveillance that must have required significant planning and travel time. "Look at the dates," I pointed out, showing Bobby the timestamps on the digital photos from later years. "They correspond with times when he told me he was going out of town for work. He'd disappear for a weekend every few months, and I always assumed he was bidding on jobs in other cities. Bobby examined each photograph carefully, and I could see him processing not just the visual evidence of Dad's secret involvement in his life, but the emotional implications of having a biological father who'd cared enough to track his development while being unable to participate in it directly. Did he ever try to contact my adoptive parents? Bobby asked. Did he ever try to get custody or visitation rights? I don't think so, I replied. Based on what Angel told me, the adoption was arranged specifically to keep you safe from the situation she was escaping. Your adoptive parents knew your mother was in danger, but they didn't know the details of who was threatening her. If Dad had tried to establish legal rights, it would have exposed the truth about why the adoption was necessary. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the complexity of a situation where a man's love for his son had been inextricably tangled with the crimes that had made his son's adoption necessary. Dad had wanted to be part of Bobby's life, but his own actions had made that impossible. He'd found a way to contribute financially to Bobby's upbringing, but only by maintaining the fiction that he was paying for Angel's medical care, rather than acknowledging their biological relationship. Can I ask you about your childhood? Bobby said eventually. What was it like being raised by him? Was he ever violent with you or your mother? The question forced me to examine memories I'd been avoiding since discovering the contents of Dad's toolbox. Had there been signs of the capacity for violence that I'd missed or explained away? Had the man who'd brutalized Angel ever shown glimpses of that same potential for cruelty in his interactions with his legitimate family? He never hit me, I said slowly, trying to be honest about the distinctions that mattered. He never even raised his voice to me actually. But there was always an undercurrent of anger in our house, especially during my parents' marriage. He and Mom fought constantly, usually about money, or his work schedule or decisions she thought he was making without consulting her. I paused, remembering arguments I'd overheard as a child, the tension that had filled our house during the months leading up to my parents' divorce. Mom used to accuse him of having secrets, of making financial decisions that didn't make sense, of being obsessed with work in ways that suggested he was hiding something. At the time I thought she was just being paranoid or controlling, but now I realize she was probably picking up on signs that he was leading a double life. Bobby made more notes, his engineering mind apparently approaching this family history as a problem to be solved through careful analysis of available data. When did your parents divorce? I was 12, so that would have been 2009, about 6 years after Angel escaped and you were born. Mom married Dad's business partner Greg within a year, which meant the two men who controlled my childhood had been working together during the time when Dad was committing his crimes. The implication hung between us like a physical presence. If Dad's business partner had married Mom so quickly after the divorce, it suggested their relationship had been developing while she was still married to Dad. But more significantly, it meant Greg had been part of the business empire that had facilitated the cover-up of Angel's kidnapping and assault. Do you think your mother knew? Bobby asked, and I realized this was the question I'd been avoiding since I'd first learned about Dad's crimes. I think she suspected something, I said slowly. The financial irregularities alone would have been hard to hide completely. But I don't think she knew the specific details, and I definitely don't think she knew about you. She's not the kind of person who could have kept that secret for 22 years without it affecting how she treated me. Bobby nodded, but I could see him filing away information that would help him understand the family dynamics that had shaped the first half of his life, even though he'd been protected from experiencing them directly. His adoptive parents had given him stability and honesty that neither Dad nor Mom had been capable of providing during those same years. Angel said there were other people involved in covering up what happened. Bobby continued. A whole network of business associates and city officials who helped make sure the truth never came out. Do you know who they were? I told him about David Brennan's threatening phone call, about the evidence of intimidation tactics being used against me for cooperating with the police investigation, about the connections I'd discovered between Dad's clients and local power brokers who'd had the influence necessary to manipulate the original investigation. So the people who helped cover up my mother's kidnapping are still in positions of power. Bobby said, his voice carrying a note of anger that was the first strong emotion he'd shown since we'd started talking. They're still capable of threatening people who try to expose what they did, and they're still protecting each other 22 years later. That's what it looks like, I confirmed. And that's why Angel wanted you to understand the scope of what you're potentially walking into. This isn't just about learning family history, it's about confronting people who've spent decades keeping secrets that could destroy their careers and reputations if they ever became public. Bobby closed his notebook and looked directly at me with an expression that reminded me so strongly of Dad that it took my breath away. It was the same stubborn set of his jaw that Dad had worn when he was facing a problem that seemed impossible to solve, the same determination that had driven him to work 3 jobs to put me through college even when his own business was struggling. "What do you want to do about it?" Bobby asked, and I realized he was asking whether I was willing to continue cooperating with the police investigation despite the risks, whether I was prepared to see this through to whatever conclusion awaited us. "I want the truth to come out," I said, without hesitation. "I want Angel to finally get justice for what was done to her, and I want the people who covered it up to face consequences for their actions. But I also want you to understand that choosing to be part of this investigation means accepting risks that could affect the rest of your life." Bobby was quiet for a long moment, staring at the memorial stones that marked the names of people who died too young, thinking about choices that would define how he remembered his biological father, and how he positioned himself in relation to the crimes that had shaped his existence. "My adoptive parents always told me that I came from a situation involving violence," he finally said. "They raised me to believe that sometimes good people have to stand up to powerful people who abuse their positions, even when it's dangerous or difficult. They taught me that running away from hard truths doesn't make them less true, it just makes them more powerful." He turned to look at me directly, and I could see the influence of 22 years of being raised by people who'd prioritized honesty and courage over comfort and convenience. "I want to help," Bobby said simply. "I want to meet with Detective Santos and provide whatever information might be useful for the investigation. I want to support Angel in whatever way she needs as she tells her story officially. And I want to make sure that the people who covered up these crimes understand that their victims aren't going to stay silent anymore." The decision felt momentous, like a line being crossed that would change everything about how both of us related to our shared history and separate futures. Bobby was choosing to align himself with justice rather than family loyalty, with truth rather than comfort, with the needs of victims rather than the convenience of people in power. "There's one more thing you should know," I said, pulling out the final document I'd brought with me. "Detective Santos found additional evidence during her investigation. Financial records showing that the payments Dad made weren't just going to Angel and to your trust fund. There were other payments, to other people, suggesting that you and Angel weren't his only victims. The bank statements I showed Bobby documented transfers to accounts registered under different names in different cities, following the same pattern as the payments to Angel, but spanning different time periods. Some overlapped with Angel's time frame, suggesting Dad had been victimizing multiple women simultaneously. Others came later, indicating that his crimes had continued for years after Angel's escape. "How many others?" Bobby asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We don't know yet. Detective Santos is working with federal authorities to trace the accounts and identify the recipients. But based on the financial patterns, there could be as many as 6 or 7 additional victims over a 15-year period." The scope of Dad's crimes was expanding beyond anything I'd initially imagined. This wasn't a single incident that had spiraled out of control, or even an isolated period of violence that he'd later regretted. This was evidence of a systematic pattern of predatory behavior that had continued for over a decade, involving multiple victims who'd been silenced through the same network of corruption and intimidation that had protected him after Angel's escape. Bobby absorbed this information with the same analytical approach he'd brought to everything else we'd discussed, but I could see the emotional toll it was taking. Learning that your biological father was a criminal was difficult enough. Learning that he was a serial predator who'd destroyed multiple lives was something else entirely. "The other victims," Bobby said finally, "do they know about each other? Do they know about the investigation?" "Detective Santos is trying to contact them," I replied. "But many of them may have changed their names or moved to different states specifically to escape the situation they were in. Finding them and convincing them to trust law enforcement after the system failed them the first time is going to be challenging." Bobby stood up and walked over to the memorial stones, reading the names of people who died too young, and thinking about all the ways a life could be destroyed without actually ending. When he came back to the bench, his expression had changed from analytical to determined. "We need to find them," he said with conviction. "All of them. They deserve to know they're not alone anymore, that someone finally believes them, and that the person who hurt them is never going to hurt anyone else."
The conversation that followed lasted another 2 hours, as we planned how to support Detective Santos's investigation while protecting ourselves from the people who were already escalating their intimidation tactics. Bobby's perspective as someone who'd been raised outside the network of corruption that had protected Dad's crimes was invaluable. He could see patterns and connections that I'd missed because I'd been too close to the situation. By the time we parted ways, we'd established a foundation for a relationship that neither of us had expected to develop. We were siblings connected by shared DNA, and shared determination to ensure that our father's victims finally received the justice they'd been denied for over 2 decades. We were allies in a fight against people who'd used their power to protect criminals and silence victims. And we were 2 young adults, trying to build something positive from the wreckage of secrets that had shaped both our lives in ways we were only beginning to understand. The drive back to my apartment that evening felt different than previous drives through the same familiar streets. I was no longer just Sarah Mitchell, the daughter of a man who'd hidden terrible secrets in his toolbox. I was now Sarah Mitchell, the sister of Bobby Morris, the ally of Angel Martinez, and the target of powerful people who were determined to keep the truth buried. But I was also someone who'd discovered that family could be chosen as well as inherited, that courage could be learned as well as taught, and that sometimes the most important relationships are the ones that form when people decide to stand together against injustice, regardless of the personal cost. The investigation that would follow would test all of these newfound convictions, would force both Bobby and me to confront truths about our father that were even more devastating than what we'd already learned, and would ultimately bring us face to face with the network of people who'd spent decades protecting the man whose crimes had shaped both our lives. But that night, driving through the Phoenix streets that Dad had helped build, I felt something I hadn't experienced since opening his toolbox: hope that the truth would finally be strong enough to overcome the lies that had protected it for so long. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, sterile in the way that government buildings always are, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. 6 months had passed since that first phone call from Detective Santos, 6 months of investigations and depositions, and sleepless nights wondering whether we were strong enough to see this through to the end. Now sitting in the front row next to Bobby and Angel, watching David Brennan shuffle papers at the defendant's table while trying to maintain the dignified bearing of a man who wasn't about to be exposed as a co-conspirator in decades of criminal activity, I finally understood what justice actually looked like. It wasn't the dramatic courtroom scenes you see in movies, with passionate speeches and sudden revelations that change everything in an instant. Real justice was quieter, more methodical, built on thousands of small pieces of evidence that accumulated over months until the weight of truth became impossible to deny. Detective Santos had been relentless in tracking down the financial records, interviewing witnesses, and building connections between Dad's crimes and the network of people who'd helped him cover them up. The case that emerged was more comprehensive and more devastating than any of us had initially imagined. 7 additional victims had been identified, women ranging in age from 19 to 25, who'd worked for various construction companies connected to Mitchell and Sons between 2001 and 2015. Each had experienced some version of what Angel had endured, though the duration and severity varied depending on circumstances that seemed to follow no pattern, except Dad's opportunity and inclination. Some had been held for weeks, others for months. Some had escaped on their own, others had been released when Dad grew tired of them or found new targets. All had been silenced through a combination of threats, financial payments, and systematic manipulation of law enforcement investigations. The network that had protected Dad extended far beyond what we'd originally understood. Brennan had been the central coordinator, using his legal expertise to arrange adoptions, relocations, and financial settlements that transformed criminal activity into civil matters, handled through private agreements. But he'd been supported by police officials, who'd ensured that investigations were dropped or misdirected, judges who'd sealed records, or dismissed cases on technical grounds, and business leaders who'd provided employment opportunities and character references that established Dad's reputation as a respected community member. Frank DiMaggio, Dad's business partner who'd eventually married my mother, had served as the operational coordinator, identifying potential victims among temporary employees and subcontractors, providing locations where women could be held without detection, and managing the logistics of cleanup operations when situations became too risky to maintain. The construction sites that had defined my childhood. The places where Dad had taught me about measuring twice and cutting once had also served as hunting grounds, where he'd selected victims, and testing grounds where he'd refined techniques for making people disappear, without leaving traces that investigators could follow. The financial scope of the cover-up operation was staggering. Over 14 years, more than $2 million had been paid to victims, their families, and various intermediaries, who'd helped maintain silence about crimes that should have resulted in multiple life sentences. The money had come from a combination of sources: legitimate business profits mixed with funds skimmed from city contracts and insurance settlements, creating a financing structure that had allowed the network to operate like a private justice system that served the interests of perpetrators rather than victims. But perhaps the most chilling discovery had been the documentation. Brennan had kept meticulous records of everything, apparently believing that detailed files would protect him if any member of the network ever decided to cooperate with law enforcement. His office safe had contained photographs, medical records, financial statements, and correspondence that chronicled every aspect of the operation, including planning documents for crimes that had never been committed, and contingency plans for situations that had never materialized. Angel was called as the first witness, and watching her walk to the witness stand was like observing someone step out of shadows that had hidden her for over 2 decades. She'd changed in the months since our first meeting, growing stronger and more confident as she'd worked with prosecutors to prepare her testimony. The woman who'd seemed fragile and hyper-vigilant in the memorial garden had been replaced by someone who radiated the quiet power that comes from finally being believed and supported by people with the authority to act on the truth. Her testimony lasted 3 hours, methodical and devastating in its detail. She described the progression of Dad's behavior from inappropriate comments to physical intimidation, to outright kidnapping, the months of captivity that had included sexual assault, psychological torture, and threats against family members who might report her disappearance. She explained how the network had managed her medical care after she'd been beaten unconscious, how Brennan had arranged Bobby's adoption while she was still recovering from injuries, and how the financial payments had come with explicit threats about what would happen if she ever attempted to contact law enforcement or return to Arizona. The money wasn't generosity, Angel said, her voice steady, despite the emotional weight of what she was describing. It was a leash. Every month when that payment arrived, it reminded me that they knew where I was, that they were watching me, and that my safety depended on my continued silence. I couldn't build a normal life because I was always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if they'd decided I was becoming too much of a risk to leave alive. The defense attorney, a sharp-dressed woman who specialized in representing white-collar criminals, tried to portray Angel as an unreliable witness whose memory had been distorted by decades of psychological trauma, and whose motivations were suspect given the financial benefits she'd received from her relationship with the defendants. But Angel's testimony was corroborated by medical records, financial documents, and recorded phone conversations that Brennan had apparently made without informing his co-conspirators. Bobby testified next, describing how his adoptive parents had been told that his biological mother was fleeing domestic violence, but had never been given details about the specific nature of the threats she was escaping. His testimony established that the adoption had been arranged specifically to hide him from Dad, that his adoptive parents had been chosen because they lived in a different state and had no connections to the Arizona construction industry, and that the trust fund payments had been structured to avoid creating any paper trail that might lead investigators back to Mitchell and Sons. I grew up knowing I was adopted, Bobby said, addressing the jury with the same analytical clarity he'd brought to our first conversation. My parents were always honest about that, and they told me that someday I might want to learn about my biological family. But they also made it clear that my birth mother had been in danger, and that my safety had required keeping my origins secret. What I didn't understand until recently was that the danger hadn't ended when I was born. It had been managed through a system of payments and threats that had controlled both our lives for over 20 years. When it was my turn to testify, I felt the weight of 28 years of misunderstood family history settling on my shoulders like a physical presence. The prosecutors had prepared me for the kinds of questions I'd face, but nothing could have prepared me for the emotional impact of describing my father's double life to a room full of strangers who would decide whether his crimes deserved punishment or whether his victims deserved justice. I started with the discovery of the toolbox, explaining how I'd expected to find the normal contents of a contractor's workspace, but had instead uncovered evidence that my entire understanding of my father's character had been built on lies. I described the photographs that had shown Angel's injuries, the financial records that had documented years of payments to multiple victims, and the handwritten letters that had revealed Dad's awareness of the harm he'd caused and his inability to stop himself from causing more. The man who raised me taught me that good people take responsibility for their actions, I said, looking directly at the jury. He taught me that fixing problems requires acknowledging what went wrong and working consistently to make things right. But he also taught me these lessons, while spending decades avoiding responsibility for the most serious problems he'd created, while paying money to victims, instead of facing consequences for his actions, and while allowing other people to be punished for crimes he'd committed. The defense attorney's cross-examination focused on my emotional state following Dad's death, suggesting that grief and shock had led me to misinterpret evidence that could be explained through legitimate business activities. She pointed out that I'd had no direct knowledge of any criminal activity, that my testimony was based entirely on documents and photographs I'd discovered after my father's death, and that my cooperation with law enforcement might be motivated by a desire to distance myself from family scandals that could damage my own reputation. Mitchell, she said, her voice carrying the practiced skepticism that defense attorneys use to undermine witness credibility, isn't it possible that your father's payments to these women were exactly what Mr. Brennan described, compensation for workplace injuries that were handled through private settlements to avoid costly litigation? The question hung in the courtroom air like a challenge. And I realized that this was the moment when I had to choose between the comfortable lie that would protect my family's reputation and the difficult truth that would honor the suffering of women I'd never met, but whose pain had shaped my entire life. No, I said, my voice carrying more strength than I'd expected. Because workplace injury settlements don't require victims to change their names and move to different states, they don't involve threats against family
members or surveillance photographs taken without consent. And they don't continue for decades after the original incident, escalating in amount based on birthdays and graduations of children who were supposedly unrelated to the person making the payments. The other victims testified over the next 3 days, each adding details that filled in gaps in the larger picture while establishing patterns that demonstrated the systematic nature of Dad's crimes and the network's response to them. Maria Santos, who'd worked as a translator for a subcontractor in 2007, described being held in the basement of a house that had been purchased through a shell corporation registered to one of Brennan's law firm clients. Jennifer Walsh, a temporary administrative assistant, explained how she'd been told that her family would be harmed if she ever reported what had happened to her during the 6 weeks she'd been missing from her job in 2012. Each testimony was devastating in its specificity, but together they created a composite picture of predatory behavior that had been enabled by people in positions of trust and authority. The women who'd survived Dad's crimes hadn't just been victimized by one individual, they'd been betrayed by an entire system that had prioritized the protection of powerful men over the safety of vulnerable women. The most damaging testimony came from Detective Raymond Torres, the original investigator who'd handled Angel's missing person case in 2003. Now retired and diagnosed with terminal cancer, Torres had decided to cooperate with prosecutors after being granted immunity for his role in the cover-up. His testimony revealed the specific mechanisms through which police investigations had been manipulated, how evidence had been suppressed or destroyed, and how pressure from senior officials had forced him to close cases that should have resulted in arrests and prosecutions. "I knew what I was doing was wrong," Torres said, his voice barely audible in the silent courtroom. "But I was a junior detective with a family to support, and I was told that pursuing these cases would end my career and potentially put my own family at risk. I told myself that the women were being compensated, that they'd agreed to private settlements, that justice was being served through channels that didn't require putting them through the trauma of public trials." His testimony established that the cover-up had extended to the highest levels of local law enforcement, involving police chiefs who'd received campaign contributions from businesses connected to the network. Prosecutors who'd been promised lucrative private sector jobs in exchange for their cooperation, and judges who'd been provided with information that could be used to blackmail them if they ever refused to cooperate with requests to dismiss cases or seal records. The scope of corruption was so extensive that federal authorities had been forced to bring in investigators from outside Arizona to ensure that the current prosecution wasn't compromised by ongoing relationships between defendants and local officials. The case had become more than a prosecution of individuals who'd covered up specific crimes. It had become an examination of how systems of power could be manipulated to protect criminals while silencing their victims. Brennan's defense strategy had initially focused on portraying him as a lawyer who'd been manipulated by his clients into believing that he was facilitating legitimate settlements rather than criminal cover-ups. But as the evidence mounted, his attorneys had shifted to arguing that he'd been coerced into participating by threats against his own family, that he'd been as much a victim of the network as the women whose suffering he'd helped conceal. The strategy collapsed when prosecutors introduced recorded phone conversations that Brennan had apparently made as insurance policies against his co-conspirators. The recordings revealed him coordinating efforts to intimidate witnesses, discussing strategies for discrediting victims who might be considering cooperation with law enforcement, and planning activities that went far beyond the passive facilitation of settlement agreements. "We need to make sure Maria Santos understands the consequences of changing her story," Brennan's voice said on one recording from 2015. "Her sister works for the school district, and it would be unfortunate if budget cuts required eliminating her position. Sometimes people make better decisions when they understand how their choices affect their families." The trial lasted 6 weeks, during which time Bobby and I developed the kind of relationship that forms between people who've survived something traumatic together. We met for coffee every morning before court sessions, processing the previous day's testimony and preparing ourselves for whatever revelations awaited us. We supported each other through moments when the evidence became overwhelming, when the scope of Dad's crimes seemed too extensive to comprehend, when the knowledge that we'd been shaped by secrets this devastating threatened to undermine our sense of identity and stability. But we also discovered that we shared more than just DNA and traumatic family history. Bobby had inherited Dad's mechanical aptitude and applied it to engineering projects that solved problems for people rather than creating them. I had inherited Dad's attention to detail and used it in marketing campaigns that helped small businesses succeed rather than in covering up crimes. We'd both been shaped by his influence, but we'd channeled that influence in directions that honored the best parts of what he'd taught us while rejecting the worst parts of what he'd done. The verdict came on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, 6 months after I'd first opened Dad's toolbox and discovered evidence that had changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Brennan was convicted on 17 felony counts, including conspiracy to commit kidnapping, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and racketeering. His sentence of 25 years in federal prison ensured that he'd spend the rest of his life paying for his role in protecting criminals while silencing their victims. Frank DiMaggio, my former stepfather, was convicted on 12 felony counts and sentenced to 18 years in prison. The other co-conspirators, including police officials, judges, and business leaders who'd facilitated the cover-up, received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with prosecutors. But the most significant outcome wasn't the prison sentences or financial penalties imposed on people who'd spent decades avoiding consequences for their actions. The most significant outcome was the establishment of a victim compensation fund that would provide long-term support for the women whose lives had been destroyed by Dad's crimes and the network that had protected him. Angel would finally receive the resources she needed to rebuild her life without looking over her shoulder. The other victims would have access to counseling, medical care, and financial assistance that acknowledged the harm they'd suffered and their right to support as they continued healing from trauma that had shaped decades of their lives. The fund also included provisions for Bobby's education and future security, recognizing that he'd been as much a victim of the network's crimes as the women who'd been directly assaulted. His existence had been used as a tool of control over Angel, his adoption had been arranged to facilitate cover-up activities, and his identity had been hidden to protect criminals rather than to ensure his safety. On the final day of the trial, after the verdicts had been read and the sentences imposed, Angel, Bobby, and I stood together on the courthouse steps facing a crowd of reporters who wanted to know how it felt to see justice finally served after decades of delays and denials. The questions were predictable, focused on our emotional reactions and our plans for moving forward, but I found myself thinking about something Detective Santos had said during her testimony. "Justice isn't just about punishing people who've done wrong," she'd told the jury. "It's about acknowledging truth, supporting victims, and creating systems that prevent similar harm from occurring in the future. Sometimes justice takes decades to arrive, but it's never too late for truth to matter." Standing there in the Arizona sunshine, surrounded by people who'd risked their safety to ensure that truth finally mattered more than power, I realized that the story I'd been living had always been bigger than my father's crimes or my family's secrets. It had been a story about systems that protect perpetrators while silencing victims, about the courage required to challenge those systems, and about the kinds of relationships that form between people who choose truth over comfort. Bobby returned to Los Angeles the next day, back to his engineering job and his adoptive family who'd supported him throughout the trial process. But our relationship continued through regular phone calls, shared holidays, and the kind of planning conversations that siblings have when they're building something together. We decided to establish a foundation that would support victims of crimes involving networks of powerful people, providing resources for investigation and prosecution in cases where local authorities might be compromised by relationships with perpetrators. Angel decided to stay in Arizona, at least temporarily, explaining that she'd spent 22 years running from this place and these people, and now she wanted to see what it felt like to walk through Phoenix streets without fear. She enrolled in college courses, started volunteering with organizations that supported crime victims, and began writing a book about her experiences that would ensure other victims knew they weren't alone, and that justice was possible even when it seemed impossible. The house where Dad had lived, where I'd discovered the contents of his toolbox, was sold to pay legal fees and victim compensation costs. But before the new owners took possession, I returned one final time to the garage where everything had started, where I'd opened a red Craftsman toolbox, expecting to find screwdrivers and socket wrenches, and instead found evidence that would reshape my understanding of family, truth, and justice. The garage was empty now, cleaned out and ready for whatever projects the new owners would pursue in the space where Dad had kept his secrets. But standing there in the late afternoon light, I could still see the workbench where his toolbox had sat, still remember the sound of metal latches opening to reveal photographs and documents that had changed everything. The tools themselves had been sold along with the rest of his equipment, but I'd kept one item, a small level that he'd used for countless projects over the years. It was scratched and worn from decades of use, with measurements that had helped him ensure that walls were straight, floors were even, and foundations were solid. Now it sits on my desk at work, a reminder that the most important construction project isn't building structures that will last for decades, but building relationships based on truth that will support justice even when justice seems impossible to achieve. The story that began with the discovery of secrets hidden in a toolbox had become a story about the power of truth to overcome systems designed to protect lies. It had become a story about family relationships that could be chosen as well as inherited, about courage that could be learned through necessity, and about justice that could arrive decades late but still arrive with enough force to change everything. Most importantly, it had become a story about hope, about the possibility that people who've been silenced can find their voices, that victims who've been isolated can find allies, and that systems designed to protect the powerful can be challenged by people who refuse to accept that comfort is more important than truth. The red Craftsman toolbox that had started everything was now evidence in a federal case, locked away in a facility where it would remain until appeals were exhausted and sentences completed. But the tools it had contained, the evidence that had seemed too terrible to believe, had built something more lasting than any construction project Dad had ever completed. They'd built a foundation for justice that would support other victims, other families, other people who would someday find themselves facing impossible choices between protecting comfortable lies and pursuing difficult truths. 5 years have passed since the trial ended, 5 years since I stood on those courthouse steps trying to explain to reporters how it felt to watch justice finally arrive for crimes that had shaped my entire life without my knowledge. The Phoenix skyline has changed during those years, new buildings rising where Dad's construction company once worked, new developments sprawling across desert land that holds memories of violence most people will never know existed. But the changes that matter most aren't visible from the outside. Angel kept her promise to herself about staying in Arizona long enough to walk through Phoenix streets without fear. She earned her degree in social work, established a nonprofit organization that provides support services for victims of organized crimes, and published a memoir that became required reading in criminal justice programs across the country. Her book titled Hidden in Plain Sight, Surviving a Network of Silence, has helped hundreds of other victims understand that their experiences weren't isolated incidents, but part of larger patterns of abuse that require systemic responses, rather than individual solutions. She bought a house in Tempe, not far from the university, where she teaches part-time courses on victim advocacy and trauma-informed investigation techniques. The house has a large garden where she grows vegetables and flowers, a visible symbol of her ability to nurture life after spending decades running from people who'd tried to destroy hers. She visits Bobby in Los Angeles several times a year, and he comes to Phoenix regularly, their relationship having evolved into something that resembles what a normal mother-son connection might have looked like if circumstances had been different.
Bobby completed his master's degree in structural engineering and now works for a firm that specializes in designing buildings for earthquake-prone areas, applying his skills to create structures that can withstand forces trying to bring them down. He married a woman named Elena, who works as a prosecutor specializing in human trafficking cases, and they're expecting their first child in the spring. When Bobby told me Elena was pregnant, he also told me he'd chosen names that honor both the family that raised him and the family he'd discovered through tragedy. If the baby is a boy, they'll name him David Morris Mitchell, combining his adoptive father's name with Dad's surname but claiming it for something positive. If it's a girl, they'll name her Hope Angela Morris, acknowledging both Angel's strength and their shared belief that difficult truths can lead to better futures. The foundation Bobby and I established has grown beyond what either of us initially envisioned. The Mitchell-Morris Foundation for Justice provides funding for investigations into cases where local authorities may be compromised by relationships with perpetrators, legal support for victims who've been silenced through intimidation or financial coercion, and educational programs that teach people how to recognize and report signs of organized criminal activity. We've assisted with 17 major investigations across 12 states, helping to expose networks of corruption that had operated for years without detection. Our most recent case involved a construction company in Nevada that was using immigrant workers as victims of forced labor while bribing immigration officials to avoid investigations. The patterns were depressingly familiar: powerful people exploiting vulnerable populations while using their connections to law enforcement and local government to avoid consequences. But this time, instead of decades of silence followed by accidental discovery, the crimes were exposed and prosecuted within 18 months of our initial involvement. I left my marketing job 2 years ago to work full-time for the foundation, using the skills Dad had taught me about systematic problem-solving to develop strategies for dismantling criminal networks rather than for promoting consumer products. The work is harder than anything I'd done previously, emotionally demanding in ways that require constant attention to self-care and boundaries. But it's also more meaningful than anything I'd imagined possible, knowing that the worst chapter of my family's history has become the foundation for work that prevents similar harm from happening to other families. My relationship with Mom and Greg required years of difficult conversations before we found a way to coexist peacefully. Mom's initial response to the trial had been denial and anger, accusations that I'd destroyed the family's reputation for attention or money or revenge against people who'd tried to protect me from painful truths. It took time for her to understand that the family's reputation had been built on lies that required other people's suffering to maintain, and that protecting those lies meant continuing to harm people who'd already been victimized. Greg's involvement in the cover-up network had been more extensive than any of us initially realized, though his cooperation with prosecutors eventually resulted in a reduced sentence of 3 years in federal prison. He served 18 months before being released on parole, and he now works as a construction supervisor for a company that builds affordable housing for veterans. His marriage to Mom survived, though they moved to a smaller house in a different part of the city and maintain much lower profiles than they'd enjoyed during their years as successful business owners. Tyler, my half-brother who was 16 when everything exploded into public view, struggled initially with learning that his father had been involved in covering up serious crimes. He spent a year in counseling, working through anger and confusion about family loyalty versus moral responsibility, about loving people who'd done terrible things, and about carrying a family name that had become associated with corruption and violence. He's now studying criminal justice at Arizona State University, planning to become a detective who specializes in investigating crimes involving official corruption. The relationships within our reconstructed family are complicated but honest in ways they never were before the truth came out. We gather for holidays and birthdays, including Bobby and Angel, in celebrations that acknowledge both the harm that brought us together and the healing that's allowed us to build something positive from that foundation. These aren't the comfortable family gatherings of people who've never faced serious challenges together. These are the deeper connections of people who've chosen to love each other despite knowing the worst truths about their shared history. Detective Santos retired from the Phoenix Police Department after receiving recognition for her work on our case, but she continues working as a consultant for federal agencies investigating organized criminal activity. She's become something of a legend in law enforcement circles, known for her ability to trace financial networks and identify corruption patterns that less experienced investigators might miss. She sends me updates on cases where techniques developed during our investigation have been applied to expose other criminal networks, proof that the lessons learned from Dad's crimes continue to prevent new victims from suffering similar harm. The impact of our case extended far beyond the individual prosecutions and prison sentences. The systemic corruption that had protected Dad's network led to comprehensive reforms in how Arizona handles cases involving potential conflicts of interest between law enforcement officials and local business leaders. New protocols require outside investigators for cases where victims report that local authorities are reluctant to pursue charges against prominent community members. Victim advocacy organizations now receive state funding to provide independent support services that don't depend on cooperation from potentially compromised local officials. Most significantly, the case established legal precedents for prosecuting criminal networks that operate across multiple jurisdictions while using corruption to avoid detection. Federal authorities now have expanded powers to investigate situations where patterns suggest that local corruption may be protecting criminal activity, and victims have additional legal options for seeking justice when local systems fail them. But the changes that matter most to me personally are quieter and more private. I've learned that family isn't just about shared DNA or shared history, but about shared commitment to truth and justice even when those commitments require difficult choices. Bobby and I have become genuine siblings, not because we were raised together, but because we chose to stand together when standing together was the only way to ensure that victims received the justice they deserved. I've learned that healing from trauma doesn't require forgetting what happened or forgiving people who've caused harm, but it does require refusing to let that harm define the boundaries of what's possible in the future. Angel's strength in rebuilding her life, Bobby's determination to use his talents for positive purposes, and even Tyler's decision to pursue a career fighting corruption all demonstrate that people can transform their worst experiences into sources of wisdom and motivation for helping others. I've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act according to your values even when acting requires facing consequences that seem overwhelming. Opening Dad's toolbox and calling the police was terrifying, but it was also the most important decision I've ever made, the choice that allowed me to become someone I could respect rather than someone who'd chosen comfort over truth. Most importantly, I've learned that justice delayed isn't necessarily justice denied, that systems designed to protect the powerful can be challenged and changed by people who refuse to accept that victims should suffer in silence to preserve other people's comfort. The women who'd been harmed by Dad's crimes had waited decades for anyone to believe them, to support them, and to hold their attackers accountable. When that support finally arrived, it arrived with enough force to change not just their individual circumstances, but the systems that had failed them. Today marks the 5th anniversary of the day I found Dad's toolbox and discovered evidence that would change everything I thought I knew about my family and myself. I'm spending the anniversary in a way that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago, at a conference where victim advocates, law enforcement officials, and criminal justice reformers are sharing strategies for preventing and prosecuting organized criminal activity. I'm presenting a workshop on recognizing signs that criminal networks may be using corruption to avoid detection, teaching techniques that could help other people identify situations like the one that shaped my family's history. The audience includes police officers, prosecutors, social workers, and survivor advocates from across the country, people who work every day to ensure that victims receive support and perpetrators face consequences. Many of them have their own stories of discovering that systems they'd trusted had been compromised by corruption, that people they'd respected had been involved in covering up serious crimes, that justice sometimes requires challenging institutions and individuals who seem too powerful to confront. During the question and answer session, a young woman raises her hand and asks how I maintain hope when working on cases that reveal such extensive corruption and systematic failure. It's a question I've been asked many times over the past 5 years, and my answer has evolved as I've gained experience and perspective on what we've accomplished and what still needs to be done. Hope isn't something you maintain by ignoring difficult realities, I tell her, thinking about Angel's garden in Tempe, Bobby's building designs that can withstand earthquakes, and Tyler's plans to become a detective who fights corruption. Hope is something you build by refusing to accept that those realities can't be changed. Every case we investigate successfully, every victim who receives support, every corrupt official who faces consequences, creates evidence that change is possible even when change seems impossible. After the conference ends, I drive to the Memorial Garden where Angel and I first met, where Bobby and I planned our strategy for supporting the investigation, where we made decisions that transformed our shared trauma into shared purpose. The desert plants are blooming, small flowers that seem impossibly delicate for such harsh conditions, but that return every year, despite heat and drought and soil that seems too poor to support life. I think about Dad's toolbox, now stored in a federal evidence facility, and about the tools it contained that were supposed to help him build things that would last. He'd taught me that the most important skill in construction was using the right tool for the job, but he'd never taught me that the most important skill in life was choosing jobs that were worth doing. The evidence he'd hidden in that toolbox had given us the tools we needed to build something he'd never intended, a foundation for justice that would support other victims and challenge other networks of corruption. The sun is setting over the Phoenix skyline, casting long shadows across the memorial garden where people come to remember loved ones who died too young, but I'm not here to remember the dead. I'm here to celebrate the living, the survivors who found their voices, the allies who chose truth over comfort, and the possibility that even the worst secrets can become sources of strength when they're finally brought into the light. My phone buzzes with a text message from Bobby, a photo of him and Elena at their doctor's appointment, the ultrasound image that shows their baby developing normally, growing strong despite the complicated family history that will someday require explanation. The message includes a note that makes me smile, teaching this kid about tools that build rather than tools that destroy. Tomorrow will bring new cases, new victims who need support, new networks of corruption that need to be exposed and dismantled. The work will continue because the need for it continues, because systems of power will always include people who try to exploit those systems for personal gain, while silencing anyone who threatens to expose their crimes. But tonight, sitting in a memorial garden in Phoenix, surrounded by desert plants that bloom despite harsh conditions, I feel something I couldn't have imagined 5 years ago, when I first opened Dad's toolbox. I feel proud of the choices I've made, grateful for the relationships I've built, and hopeful about the future we're creating together. The worst chapter of my family's history has become the first chapter of a story about justice, truth, and the kinds of connections that form between people who refuse to let other people suffer in silence. The tools in Dad's toolbox were meant to help him build structures that would last for decades, but the evidence he'd hidden with those tools has helped us build something more lasting, a foundation for justice that will support other families facing impossible choices between protecting comfortable lies and pursuing difficult truths. Sometimes the most important construction projects are the ones that build hope from the ruins of secrets that should never have been kept. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.